Emily's going to share this last session, which I'm very excited about. I know you guys are too, and we'll end up going slightly later. But thanks so much.
Well, Mark and I said that Quill needs no introduction. So.
Hi, thanks for sticking out the whole 2 days. I know this talk is late. I think it's been a fantastic couple of days. I've been super stimulated. This is such a cool topic. It's such a beautiful building. It's such a smart, interesting group of people, and I'm just very delighted to be here. Two little things before I start talking. One is this is a brand new talk. I know myself. The first time I give a talk, I have a very hard time reining it in. So I'm going to try really hard not to talk too long. Also, the first time I give a talk, my slides have way too much stuff on them. It's just my process. I apologize. But I really will try not to go on and on because I know we're all tired. The other thing I want to say is not to do with this talk itself. I wanted to let you all know that Mark and I had been talking about the following possibility. I've been editing the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal for 15 years now. I'm about to step down. I'm breaking up with it. It's very poignant. It's a very meaningful breakup for me. I'm serious. It's funny, but I'm also serious. And I thought that it would be poetic and lovely to have the final issue that I edit for the journal be an issue on breakups, drawing on papers from this conference. There's also another conference going on similar topics at Leeds. Is it Leeds? I believe it's Leeds. So I'll probably draw from both of those conferences. So it's not exactly like a conference proceedings, but an issue based on those two conferences. There's no details about that yet, but keep that in mind if you're looking for a possible publication venue for your paper. Mark or I, or probably both of us, will be reaching out to you to talk to you about that, which I'm delighted that I had this idea, honestly. Okay, so a couple of years ago, and this is probably why I was invited to keynote this conference, I wrote this teeny tiny little piece about good breakups. And even though it was teeny tiny, I think it resonated with a lot of people. And in that piece, I argued that breakups should not be seen, or at least not automatically be seen, as failures of a relationship that should have been eternal but somehow failed to be so, but rather as the last part or the last act of something that is essentially finite. And as the last act, it should be managed well. Meanwhile, over the last several years, I've done a lot of writing quite separately, or so I thought, about sexual agency. And in particular, I've written about the idea that having the ability to exit from a sexual encounter in the right way is just as essential to meaningful agency as good consensual initiation, or the ability to enter the thing with agency, right? I didn't really think through until recently how these projects actually went together very nicely and were part of a shared larger point that I wanted to make that I think is actually quite broad and deep about temporality and agency and ethics and flourishing. It really just hadn't occurred to me that these were two pieces of this larger point. So what I'm going to do in this paper is I'm going to go back to what I did in both of those other projects and use them, but I'm also going to build something quite new out of them, which is not just new to you, but new to me, honestly. It's like a new thinking through of how these pieces come together. So I want to draw on this point about how we shouldn't think of endings as failures, but as, at their best, exercises of positive agency. We should think of endings as leaving something that is inherently finite, and when all goes well, we should leave it well. I thought that this talk, for most of these 2 days, I thought that this talk was going to be kind of a radical break with what everybody else was doing until the very last talk. I'm very grateful to the last speaker for having introduced this idea that breakups can be awesome. and are often awesome, and that the finitude of relationships is awesome. That was a very nice groundwork for what I want to do in this talk. But basically, the idea here is, look, endings are part of our lives and narratives. They're not the drop-off of our lives and narratives. And when all goes well, they shouldn't be ruptures or failures. They're rather integral parts of our narratives that, when they go well, exemplify our values and our agency, and they really ought to enhance or at least maintain rather than invalidate the value of the thing that they end. When they go well, they contribute to our crafting a good, self-determining, and evolving life that makes sense for us, and for supporting the other people involved in whatever's ending in also crafting a self-determining and evolving life that makes sense for them. I will also say this is all by way of setup, but I'm almost done by way of setup. I've noticed that this paper is part of a larger trend in my writing that has happened over the last several years now. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I'm quite delighted, where I seem to just be in a groove where what I do is I write joyful, happy papers about things that everybody else is treating as tragic and miserable. This seems to me be my brand, and I'm not mad about it. To that end, I've tried to accompany my points with great art, so enjoy the art as we go along. I hope that's part of the joyousness of it. Okay, my problem here is neither of these cursors work, and I have to remember to switch both things each time. Okay, so your first breakup probably felt like the end of the world to you, right? But by now you've probably been through a bunch of them. Do you think of all of those relationships that ended at whatever time in your past as failed relationships? This is certainly a really common turn of phrase for any relationship that ends for any reason other than death, or I guess, physical catastrophe of some sort. But why do we think of a relationship as a failure just because it ends? Why, for example, do we think of somebody who's been married several times as somebody who's at failure at relationships, rather than as somebody who's really good at forming extra intimate, meaningful relationships? Not that that's a personal point for me or anything. We don't think of an author who finishes writing many books as bad at writing books because he finished so many of them. So why do we think of people who marry many people as bad at having relationships? I really think this is an important question. Almost all of our relationships run their course, and almost all of them dissolve or transform at some point. This is true of romantic relationships, friendships, work relationships. Most of them have a finite place in our life, right? And this is certainly true for romantic relationships. Less than 50% of marriages last until death. And even if you happen to be in one of those marriages that is going to last until death, you still probably had prior relationships before that. And so it's straight mathematics that most of our romantic relationships end. And I feel like it's an odd thing to think that most human relationships are failures, right? Like, that's a weird thing to believe, that most of our relationships are failed, right? But if you think of a finite relationship that ends as a failed relationship and most of them end, then most of them are failures. I think that's just a very odd syllogism, right? But because we act as though relationships are not supposed to end, we see breakups as a kind of a tragedy. And we frame them as some sort of admission of failure or a capstone of failure. And for this reason, we often feel like there's no point to breaking up well or preserving what was of value in the relationship, because the relationship has already proven to be a failure. You've already failed at this task, so why continue trying to do it well, right? The relationship has proven itself to be a waste of time in virtue of the fact that it ended, however good it seemed at the beginning or along the way. And if breakups are essentially tragic, then they may as well include tragically bad behavior, right? We may as well go all Shakespearean and end them with abandonment and betrayal and maximizing the attempt to hurt one another and so forth. And this tragic approach is replayed and reinforced by movies, by novels, by operas. But I think that this distorted reasoning is bad for everyone. And instead, I want to urge that we should see relationships as naturally having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Of course, some of them will last till death. That's just, they're different lengths. But the natural course of things, human experiences are marked in general by finitude, and human activities are marked by finitude. And most of them will have a beginning and a middle and an end. Some of them are short stories and some of them are long stories. A small number of them will last until death. But the length of the story doesn't define its value. But on the other hand, the quality and the integrity of the end of the story really is part of its value. It doesn't define its value, but it's part of its value, rather than just being a negation of its value. And so we should hope for and try to create stories that have good endings, I want to claim. In this, it's like most of human experience, right? There's nothing special about relationships. Most of the things that we value are properly or typically finite. Most of the things that we find value in and that are meaningful to us and that we enjoy, we really wouldn't want them to go on forever, right? It would, no matter how much you love a movie, it would be terrible if it ended only in your death. And we don't want to spend forever writing a book or reading a book for that matter. Like, we want to come to the end of it. We may really passionately love the degree that we're working on, but we want it to end eventually. We don't think that because we love doing a philosophy PhD, therefore it would invalidate the whole thing if we finished our PhD before death. I think I may have some students who think that, but you should not think that, right? So given that we're not tempted by this in any other domain, including these things that are really important to us, right? Like doing a dissertation or whatever, why do we so often treat endings as failures, especially but not only for relationships? And it's not only relationships. Why do we feel like we have to stick out a job that we hate because otherwise if we quit, we're admitting failure in some sense, right? And why this is, to go back to the relationships point, but I get so depressed every time I hear this language. Why do people want to save unhappy marriages, right? Why do they think it's better to somehow find some desperate way of maintaining this thing for longer, which is unhappy, right? And behind that, there's another question, which is like, why is this considered a virtue? Why do we admire people who manage to not end things, to like stick with the job that is frustrating to them and that they hate, or to save the marriage that's miserable? We do treat these as virtues. I know I'm going to forget to do the back and forth, so please call me out if it seems like this is behind what I'm saying. Okay. All right. So how do we end up in this mess, right? Actually, sorry, that was premature. Let me add one more piece before I get to the how did we end up in this mess. So I want to claim that our romantic relationships, especially, but more generally, the way we think about a bunch of our experiences and activities, they're not just supposed to be eternal, but they're supposed to be progressive and unidirectional, right? This is kind of, I'll make this more concrete in a moment, but there's already sort of like a weird paradox. Like, if something's supposed to go on forever, it's not exactly a paradox, but it's like exhaustingly demanding, the idea that it's supposed to go on forever, but it's also supposed to always progress and in one direction, right? That's tiring to just think about it. So what is the ideology that gets us in this rut? And I think a really helpful notion here is the notion of the relationship escalator. This is a pop notion, but one that I really think is valuable. It was a term that was coined by Amy Garum in 2012. And the idea is that it's really deeply ingrained in our culture to think of romantic relationships as having a pre-given direction, right? And progressing along a pretty fixed path. And that's in the direction of greater and greater intimacy, interdependence, and economic investment and entanglement, right? And so you're supposed to go on a path that goes through dating, and then onto a commitment to monogamy, and then onto moving in together, and then combining your finances with one another, and then having children, and then ultimately arriving at like the sort of the great triad of marriage, children, and property ownership. Right? And at that apex, The relationship is supposed to last until death, right? It's not clear where you're supposed to go from there, but like once you get to that point, you're supposed to stick with that until death. And yet, at the same time, things are still supposed to progress. So it's not supposed to get stale. Somehow you're supposed to get to that point, stay at that point until you die, but nobody's supposed to get bored with that, right? They're supposed to be fulfilled and excited by this. Other features of the relationship escalator are that only two people can fit on the escalator at any one time, right? Any attempt to go partway back down the escalator to move from living together to living separately, for example, signals some kind of failure of the relationship. You're not allowed to stop the escalator. You're not allowed to go anywhere else once you get to the top of the escalator. There's no just sort of not taking the escalator at all and building a different kind of relationship. And really the only way that you can get off the escalator, other than getting to that like eternal and ever progressive top, is to fall off of it and hence to fail in some way, right? And when people have these conversations where they say, well, we need to talk about where this relationship is going, what they almost always mean is, are we on the escalator and is it moving upwards at an appropriate speed? And if not, we're wasting our time, right? Like people actually say that, like it's a waste of time unless it's going in the direction that it's supposed to go. I think that we can broaden this out even more, and this sort of attitude towards relationships fits in with an even larger ideology behind that of productivity culture, which I think goes hand in hand with this notion of kind of eternal progress, unidirectional eternal progress, and with the idea that it is virtuous to do that and never sort of get off of that path, right? So yeah, this ideal of eternality and constant progress really fits with productivity culture insofar as it fits with this ideology of efficiency and work and resilience in the context of what's supposed to be endless development, right? So for example, it's rarely questioned, though not never, and I'll talk about that in a moment, it's rarely questioned that, you know, if there's developing countries and undeveloped countries and developed countries, it would be good if the developing ones developed more and the undeveloped ones developed, right? This idea that development is always good. Similarly with like the notion of economic growth, right? It's not questioned that you want the economy to grow. Everything's supposed to grow in direction and development's supposed to go in one direction. And as a good, productive, efficient worker, you're supposed to be willing to sort of pursue that unidirectional path without end. And within this framework, breaking up or quitting or going home or shifting directions or de-escalating, these are all versions of failure, right? Versions of giving in to weakness or not maximizing your productive contribution to this developmental path. You don't want your relationship or your culture or your economy to be stagnant or to stop growing. There is, in fact, now fairly well developed, although still a little bit marginal, you know, lefty marginal branch of economics and political theory known as post-development theory, where the whole point is to question and challenge this dogma that development is always good. Right? So this is the perspective which points out that, for example, economic growth can just straightforwardly do harm. Right? It can enhance inequality, it can lessen cultural diversity, it can harm the environment. There's all sorts of ways in which economic growth can be harmful. And underneath that, right, the idea that things always have to grow is an ideological premise. It's not some sort of empirically proven fact. It's an assumption rather than something that we've shown, but it's an assumption that is rarely questioned. They also point out, and in other parts of my work, this is a point that's really important to me, but I'm going to force myself to not go on a tangent about it. There's lots of good arguments that are a combination of conceptual and empirical that show that like maximizing the economic value of each thing and each bit of land is not necessarily good for anything. This was originally put beautifully by Jane Jacobs, where she talks about how planners and developers want, you know, each square inch of a city to maximize its value. But when we leave certain buildings and neighborhoods and so on intentionally undervalued and underdeveloped, it allows certain kinds of life and creativity and diversity to happen in a city that can't happen if we're constantly maximizing value, right? So there are pushbacks against this idea that it should always be unidirectional, always more heading off into eternity, always in the same direction. But those assumptions go pretty deep. And I think we see it in graduate school too. This is, I'm in academia too, rather. This always upsets me. There are so many professors who counsel their students. I bet you have all heard this, either said to you or you've heard tell of it, right? Who say, oh, you should tell your bright undergraduates not to do a PhD if they can possibly do anything else. Because it's a terrible idea, because the chance that they'll go from the PhD to the tenure track job to tenure and so on is very low, right? And because they're not going to go down that whole unidirectional path towards eternity, we owe it to them to talk them out of ever doing it at all. I think this is tragic, right? Why isn't spending 6 years being given a modest but manageable amount of money to think about interesting things and talk to interesting people intrinsically good? Like, why, even if nobody ever got it, why is the fact that there's an ending and that we can't count on the unidirectional eternal path any count against its value? I think we're entrenching that mind frame when we tell students this. Right? Okay, so what I claim then is a bunch of things. I've already started to claim them, but now I'll spell them out in more detail, right? So I want to claim that most valuable experiences and activities are finite and not unidirectional. They have a beginning and a middle and an end, and the end is part of them rather than the point past which we care about them anymore, where they've stopped, right? So we should always think about when and how to end them well. And we should reframe leavings and endings as acts of positive agency rather than as fail points or as the end of agency. And that means that they have to be done properly. And doing them properly means doing right by ourselves and also treating others well. And this is true for breakups, but I also think it's true for endings and leavings in general. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that that relationships don't end badly all the time, with hurt and pain and betrayal, or end at a time when they really shouldn't have. But what I want to claim is that the mere fact of their ending is not a count against them or a count against their value. This is a paper that's primarily about breakups. I promise I will spend the last part of it, the large last part of it, talking explicitly about breakups. But most of what I have to say is not specific to breakups. I just want to think about endings and leavings, really. And my goal is not to give general advice on what to do about a breakup or how to have one or when to have one, because among other things, plenty of them are just going to suck no matter how hard we try. There's all kinds of breakups that there's not going to be any way to make them good. For example, there may be just like fundamentally asymmetrical needs and desires between the two partners, and there's no way of ending it well for both of them. It may be that it ends because of betrayal, or it ends because of tragic circumstances. Like, we can't always make it good, right? That's not my claim. But what I really care about is not like giving you a handbook for how to make your breakups as good as possible, but rather to really reorient our whole attitudes towards temporality and the role of exits and endings and transitions within that. Seeing endings and exits and transitions as potential sites for positive agency and fulfillment, and overcoming the myth that there's any link at all between value and eternality or constant progression. Okay. What do I mean when I say that ending and leaving should be acts of positive agency? I'm not going to give you like a rigorous discussion of positive agency here, but I want to say a little bit about it. The contrast is that, and I'm going to give you lots of juicy concrete examples of this in just a moment, but endings are often seen as the point where agency stops, right? Where agency runs out. Instead, I want to reconceive them as substantive things we do, like exiting as an activity that we engage in, or leaving as an activity that we engage in, rather than the point where our agency cuts out. Now, sometimes in some domains, so we're not consistent about this. We don't think everything is supposed to be eternal, right? Like I said, we don't want the movies to be eternal or the book writing to be eternal, right? So sometimes this is obvious. We have put a lot of time as a culture into thinking about how to like shape that ending and make it a positive, substantive thing that's satisfying. So think about graduation ceremonies or closing ceremonies or taking a bow at the end of a performance, right? These are all things that we do to sort of ritualize ending rather than seeing ending as failure. When I warn you now, there's going to be several personal anecdotes in this paper, but when my partner and I got married about a year and a half ago, mostly for visa reasons, as all good marriages are meant to be. But you know, visa reasons, but we were plenty romantic about the whole thing. Anyway, my sibling, who is a rabbi, was the one who conducted the service for us. And they wanted to know whether we wanted to do the Jewish thing of stepping on the glass at the end and breaking the glass. And I was kind of like, it's a little too Jewy for me. And my partner was like, oh, it's way too Jewy for me. So we were not into it. And my sibling, who's very wise, said, well, I'm not trying to like push the Jewish angle on you at all. I don't care about the Jewish part of it. But the reason why the breaking of the glass is such a powerful part of a Jewish wedding is because the people at the wedding really need and enjoy a positive moment of closing release that brings everybody together and is like, and we're done. And so my sibling asked us, like, is there anything that you can think of that could replace the stepping on the glass, is that kind of moment? And eventually we got married on New Year's Eve. So eventually what we did is we bought a ton of those like gay rainbow glitter party popper things. And we gave them to all the guests. And at the last moment, we all exploded glitter everywhere. And my sibling was totally right. It was very successful. But there's something about that, like making the closing a thing that you do rather than just letting the thing peter out, that I think is important, right? Okay. I promised I was going to bring together these other projects. So now I want to bring in some of this stuff about agency and exit. Right? So we often think about agency and associate agency with having control over initiating things, right? Whether it's initiating sex, like you get to choose whether that happens or not, or choosing a major, right? Like we say, you know, you're going to give a young adult the agency to choose their own major, or like getting to be the one in control of choosing our medical care or initiating treatment, right? There's a lot of focus on beginnings and initiations as the site of agency. But I want to claim that real agency also requires the ability to exit as an act, not just any old exit, but exiting as an act of self-determination and without undue or coercive penalties for exiting. And I've spelled this out most in the domain of sexual agency, but I don't think it's specific to that domain, right? But in the domain of sexual agency, clearly a vast majority of our conversations have focused on consent and refusal during the initiation of sex, right? But I've argued that the ability to exit a sexual encounter safely and easily and without having to be afraid of being the target of blame or anger, or being burdened with the need to like argue one's way out of the encounter, or to have to manage the other person's emotions excessively in terms of their disappointment or their worry that they did something wrong or whatever it may be, right? All of these ways in which exiting sex can become very burdensome, those are a problem for agency. I think that sentence had no syntax, but you got the point. Right? And I've also argued that there are various things that can support us in our ability to have this capacity to exit agentially. So some of them are things like safe words and other kinds of discursive technologies that we use to scaffold exiting a sexual situation, but some of them are much more social and infrastructural, right? So for example, whether you live in a place where there's good 24-hour public transportation so that you can actually leave and go home when you want to and not be dependent on anyone else for helping to get you home or need an expensive method of getting home is like directly a matter of supporting sexual agency. right? Lack of radical power imbalances is also a matter of supporting the ability to exit in this way. Financial independence from your partner supports the ability to exit, and so on. I want to claim that more generally, knowing when we should exit and how to exit and having the tools for exiting are skills. This resonates really nicely with the previous talk, which was lovely, right? But they're not just skills. Also, the ability to exit well and with agency requires stuff that is not a matter of individual skills. It requires good cultural scripts that show us ways to exit. It requires norms that support the possibility of exit, and it requires good social support and material support and financial support so you can exit. Right? And you can imagine right away, if the only script you're given is one that tells you that a good relationship is one that is eternal and you're a failure if you exit it, that does not give you the scaffolding that you need to be able to exit. Okay. So this extends not just to sex. I think it extends to many joint activities, particularly the kinds of joint activities in which we're sort of vulnerably entangled with one another, right? I think that there's real issues about sorry, I got stuck in my own sentence. There's real issues around agency depending on the ability to exit when it comes, for example, to sparring in martial arts, right, which can be a very agential activity, but if you don't have any say over when it ends, it ceases to be agential, right? Going on a hike with somebody is another example. Dancing with somebody is another example. And then this one also resonates with what we were just talking about in the last talk. Playing is a really interesting example, right? I actually think that if you can't exit play at will with your own agency, it's literally not play. It's not just that it's bad, it's like part of the definition of play. You know, you can be playful, but at the moment where it becomes clear that you don't have any choice but to play, you're not playing. The other person might be playing like with you in the sense that you play with a toy, but you're not playing, right? So playfulness intrinsically requires this ability to exit. Okay, what I want to do now, this has all been pretty abstract so far. I want to give you a few really concrete examples of the importance of positive agency over exiting and the ability to leave well before we get back at the end to breakups. So yeah, I want to start in a different domain, and I know this domain is going to seem weird to people, but I have some really concrete things to say about it, and I really want to use it. This is based on community work that I've been doing in Berlin with people who work on nightlife culture, which I ended up doing as an extension of my work on sexual agency, though it doesn't have much to do with sex. And it begins from the fact that, as most of you probably know, Berlin has a very active nightlife scene, to put it mildly. And parties and raves in Berlin routinely can last like 72 hours, 96 hours. That's the culture of it. People stick out the whole 72 or 96 sometimes, fueled by drugs and other ways of getting through. It's kind of a well-known thing that there's a real problem in Berlin, which is that people have a tendency to, as they put it there, chase the party, right? There's this widespread feeling that if you go out to a rave or a party or some sort of nightlife event, you have to party until you literally can't anymore. And if you manage to stick it out and not give up and go home, then on the one hand, it's like points for you, right? You're like a good, virtuous partier somehow. But also, and this is directly relevant to the relationship stuff, right? It somehow like proves that the party was good. Like, whereas if you leave and go home at a certain point, you're somehow retroactively devaluing and admitting that it wasn't a good party somehow. And so people feel like they can't leave, like they need to do anything they can. And then they end up leaving only when they truly have hit the point of total exhaustion and drug burnout and so on. And at that point, leaving becomes this sort of like tragic letdown, like, okay, I've given out now, right? The end of the party there is like a fail point. And when you decide to leave, you retroactively devalue the entire experience. This leads, as you can imagine, to some pretty dangerous behavior and exhaustion, but also it's just like less fun. And I would say it gives the event a less fulfilling narrative shape, right? It ends up with a shape where at the end you're like, ugh. You know? So I've been working with these community organizations to try to figure out how we can fix this problem or help with this problem. One of the tools, and I didn't make this up, this predated me, but when I discovered it, I was incredibly impressed by it. One of the tools that some people in Berlin have been using to try to address this, which is very simple, but I find it incredibly powerful, is what they call an intention circle. So at many of these parties, they will invite people before the rave begins or whatever to come together. And there will be somebody who will lead the intention circle, and that person will just ask questions, which you can answer or not as you see fit, about what you intend to get out of the party, what you intend the night to be shaped like, and crucially, why. Like, what kind of experience are you trying to curate? And it's a way of making people think of what's coming up as a narrative with a shape, rather than just this unidirectional thing that they will eventually fill out at the end. And so what I've showed you here is some materials that were developed by one of these collectives for a recent festival. You can see some of the questions that get asked. And part of what's nice about it for my purposes is that they have divided it into before, during, and after, right? Which fits really well with my whole idea of beginning, middle, and end, and a narrative arc. So they'll ask questions like, you know, are you coming to this party with a desire to socialize and flirt, or are you feeling more introverted? Do you want to flirt with new people who you don't know, or do you want to stick to your friend group? What drugs are you planning on doing? How did you pick those? What are you trying to get out of those, right? Why is that what you picked? How have you chosen how much you're going to do? How have you chosen when you're going to stop? And so forth. I think that this is noticeably at those events given people a healthier, better, more fun relationship to flirting, to sexual consent, to drugs, to the entire event. What's my contribution? I've been working with that collective and some others who do this kind of thing on adding new kinds of questions to the intention circle that I think are really important, and they focus on going home. Right, so I've added questions like, how will I decide when it's time to go home? Turning the decision to go home into a positive act, right, rather than a giving up. What can I look forward to when I get home, right? What am I going to do when I get home to make that a positive experience? And I give them some suggestions, like, are you going to cuddle your pets? Are you going to listen to music? Are you going to make tea? Are you going to text or call a friend in a different time zone, right? What is the positive thing that comes after the party? This reframes the transition as a step to a new positive thing and not just the loss of the previous thing, right? Also, I've added things like, what do I need to get home safely, both physically and emotionally? Right? Do I need to leave with somebody? Do I need to arrange in advance for somebody to check on me when I get home? Do I need to set a hard stop time to when I'm going to go home or when? All of this turns going home and leaving into part of the narrative of the party and the evening rather than its drop-off point. And a lot of people have found this really powerful. So now we're working on building entire workshops just on going home. And there's a real desire for this in that context, right? Similarly, to get back to my wedding, when we got married in our wedding vows, and this will connect directly to what I have to say at the end about relationships, we did a little intention circle as part of our ceremony. We talked about what we wanted out of the relationship. I mean, of course, we know we can't determine everything in advance, but why were we getting married? What did we want out of this relationship? And crucially, when would we end it? Not that we necessarily think we're going to end it. Maybe we won't. Maybe I'll be with that partner until I die. But we discussed explicitly, when would we think it was time to end it? And the answer was not when things are so desperate and we're so worn out and exhausted and miserable that we literally simply can't continue anymore, right? Okay, next example. A few of you saw me talk about this a few weeks ago. I want to talk about the radical rest movement, because this is another example where leaving is seen as failure or ending is seen as failure. Right? So productivity culture very much treats rest and sleep as what we do when we can't do anymore and our body gives out, right? Sometimes you hear people say quite proudly, I'll sleep when I'm dead, which is such a horrifying thing to say. But anyway, and socially, we treat wanting rest or wanting sleep as a kind of a sign of weakness or laziness, right? Laziness. The idea is that you're supposed to rest only when you actually need to and as little as possible. And the purpose of rest, and this is like another expression that just grates on me so much, and you hear it all the time. You don't rest until you absolutely need to, and then you rest as little as you can get away with. Why do we rest? So that we can recharge, right? People very rarely stop and think about how horrifying that is, but the idea is that the only reason that you would rest is so that you can, as quickly as possible, fill up the battery and keep going again. There have been twin political movements coming out of anti-racist praxis and out of disability activism that have both in different ways, slightly different ways, tried to reclaim rest and sleep as positive activities that can be social choices in their own right and fulfilling in their own right, rather than as weakness or fail points. And both movements see rest and sleep as inherently political. So the first is the rest as resistance movement, coming out of the so-called NAP ministry, which was founded by Tricia Hersey in 2022. Her focus is on rest as racialized. And she points out that the ways in which people are seen as deserving of rest or lazy when they rest are highly racialized, at least in the United States. Probably we could make the same argument with different texture anywhere, but her focus is on the United States. Right? So Black people and Hispanic people in particular are seen as lazy and as especially undeserving of rest. And this is true even though we've got gobs of empirical evidence that in terms of actual numbers of hours worked, Black people and Hispanic people work many more hours than white people, right? There are questions to be asked about who gets to sleep and rest, for example, in public. For whom is that a stigmatized activity? That is also highly racialized. And so this group sees rest as a form of activism, and they do things like public napping and communal sleep sessions and so forth in order to make a point. Meanwhile, over in disability studies, you have a similar movement focusing on what gets called crit time, right? This is the idea that coming out of disability activism, we should build collective resistance to our submission to shared clocks that hold all of us to the same pace of behavior and make that pace as fast as it possibly can be. Right? And in contrast, they have worked to value the fact that different people have different paces and to value lazing and resting and also accommodating and celebrating these alternative paces and timetables as positive things that are valuable in their own right, right? It's not just like, oh, disabled people can't work as much as everybody else. They need more rest. So as a matter of accommodation, you should give the poor disabled people the rest that they need because they're so weak. But rather, rest and sleep are positive agential activities that we should celebrate. So to go back to my sibling, this is a quote from a piece that they wrote in 2022. They say, before my child was born, I was afraid that my fatigue would make it impossible for me to be a good parent. And it's true that I'm often juggling parenting needs and exhaustion. What I didn't anticipate is that prioritizing rest, sleep, and dreaming is also something tangible I can offer my child. Notice the notion of positive agency. We build elaborate nests and gaze out the window together, luxuriously leaning on huge mounds of pillows. Most 3-year-olds I know fight bedtime, but we snuggle under the blankets on cold winter evenings, sighing in synchronized delight. So in both of these movements, rest and sleep are reconceived and reframed as expressions of agency rather than as losses of agency. And in both cases, these movements seek a more just distribution of rest as a positive good, right? And they want to reclaim entitlement to rest as a positive activity rather than just as an accommodation. Final example, and then we go back to relationships. In a way, I think this is the most important example. You might argue that this whole idea of trying to, against the whole tide of our culture, rethink endings and leavings as positive parts of a narrative that can be done well. Arguably, all of that ought to be traced back to the hospice movement of the 1960s. All of our lives are finite, and all of them end in death. But before the hospice movement, medicine and healthcare quite literally didn't concern themselves with dying, right? The job of medicine was to try to make people not die. The idea that that dying itself was something to be managed within medicine was not an idea yet, right? So medicine was supposed to keep people alive, if at all possible. And allowing a patient to die was sort of by conceptual definition a medical failure. You had failed to keep the patient alive, right? And then once doctors admitted that someone was irrevocably dying and that they weren't going to be able to keep them alive, they basically thought, well, then the job of medicine is done. They had no more role in it, right? So at that point, they would abandon the patient because dying was out of their purview. It was simply not something that doctors managed. They managed the not dying rather than the dying. Right? The hospice movement emerged by calling upon the healthcare profession to conceive of dying as a necessary and medically important part of living, right? Not where it drops off, but the last chapter of it. And so that movement introduced the idea of a good death and made it the job of the healthcare profession to manage death well, rather than to just try to stave it off. Right? And this is, I think this was really very deep. I think it was a major shift in how we conceived of dying. And for the first time, we thought of dying as something that itself called for care, rather than just the point where care stops. And the hospice movement taught us that since death is inevitable for everyone, helping somebody die well, comfortably and with dignity, in a way that continues to let them express their values and identity, is a medical success, not a medical failure. Right? Whereas stranding a patient once they're dying and saying there's nothing more to be done is abandonment and is medical failure. Interestingly, the two figures who founded this movement primarily were Cynthia Saunders and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was also one of the main people who developed the whole stages of grief framework that we know about. So she was actually framing dying and ending as part of a narrative that even continues beyond the event itself, which I find powerful. Another way in which this idea of death as something that could be good and ought to be thought of as a positive act of agency showed up was through the Philosopher's Brief, which was written in 1995. This was a brief submitted in response to two huge important Supreme Court cases, Washington v. Glucksberg and Vacco v. Quill. These were both about physician-assisted suicide. And it was like a who's who of 1990s Anglo-American analytic political philosophy. So you can see the names up here. I mean, truly, it was Dworkin, Nagel, Nozick, Rawls, Scanlon, and Jarvis Thompson, right? They all came together and they were not modest. They're like, we are the most important living political philosophers, and we disagree about all sorts of things, but we agree about this. And they wrote this brief together. And their key argument was that the constitutionally protected right to self-determination over the core parts of our own narrative, which was, by the way, what was used as a justification for Roe v. Wade and so on, right? This idea that we have the fundamental right to shape our own narrative, not in every detail, but in its basic core shape, right? That right includes the right to control the timing and means of your own death, because the timing and means of your own death is part of your narrative, not something that happens separate or after your narrative. And as they put it, some would choose suicide when continuing to live would disfigure rather than enhance the lives they had created. And that idea is very important for me. The idea that a good ending is one that enhances rather than disfigures the shape and value of the thing that it's ending. Right? So for them, the ending of life was a part of the life narrative, and it could go well or badly rather than just its limit point. And people had the right to be agentially in control of attempting to make it go well. So ending should be a site of positive agency. Okay, so finally we get back to breakups. So why is it so easy for us to think of breaking up as a failure that devalues the relationship, which we should stave off if at all possible? And why do we conceive of ideal relationships as eternal when in fact everything is finite, right? And why, I want to ask, are breakups generally just so terrible, right? Why are partners so mean to each other? Why are they so mean to the very same people who they loved and who they intertwined their lives with? Why do we think that that is the culturally acceptable way to end things? Let's go back to the relationship escalator for a few minutes. Garham says, since marriage or its equivalence represents the escalator's pinnacle, there's no good way to go down. Consequently, our society suffers from a dearth of models to transition or conclude relationships well. If we had better models of ending or changing relationships, we would develop better skills and social support, and so might wreak far less damage. So I think that this is my extraction from Garham. It was just a blog post, but I want to say there's really two important points here about the way that the relationship escalator messes up our relationships and our breakups, right? So first of all, the relationship escalator produces more breakups than there would otherwise be because people think, okay, well, we're not going up the escalator in the right speed, so we have to end, right? So it generates breakups that might not have had to happen. But also, that same escalator blocks our opportunities for good breakups, right? When relationships are framed as ideally unidirectional and eternal, we have no narratives for how to end them well. And so just like we have kind of a dearth of good stories about going home at the end of the party or resting or dying well, we also don't have good stories about how to end well. And crucially, we don't build social infrastructure that supports those stories. So what do I mean by a good ending then? I want to see, okay. I've been talking for a while, but I'm getting there. I knew it would be long, but it won't be hopelessly long. Okay. So what is a good ending? I don't want to give you necessarily sufficient conditions. I'm not giving you a checklist. I just want to give you a flavor for what a good ending would look like given everything I've said, right? So I think a good ending in general, ideally, it's an expression of positive agency for everyone involved. It's an integrated part of a narrative arc. By integrated, I just mean like everybody involved can sort of make sense of it and feel comfortable with the path that it's taken, right? It's well-timed. It supports flourishing for everyone involved. Everyone involved is treated with respect and dignity. And crucially, a good ending preserves recognition of the value and importance of the thing that it was ending, rather than disfiguring that. Now, not all of those things are under our control, right? We can't always make the ending good, as I said at the beginning, but we still usually can have at least some kind of substantial hand in curating our endings and in working on leaving well. And that includes enabling other people to also leave well. I think here we could take an interesting lesson from good parenting. There's a lot of bad parenting, but good parenting, right? Ideal parenting, when the child has the capacity, because there are kids for whom this narrative is not an appropriate one to look towards. But what, in the most common case, right? When parenting goes well, the parent curates and builds and creates the scaffolding for the end of child and the caregiver relationship with the child as a child. They work towards the ending of that relationship and then set the child free or mostly free when appropriate with love and respect and without rupture or abandonment. And really, ideally, that then lays the groundwork for a new relationship coming to be. It's not the end of any relationship, but it's the end of the parent-child relationship, right? So that's ending in general, but now let's think about breaking up well, right? So I want to claim a good breakup requires treating your partner well, ending at the right time, not ending when the relationship has failed and become unsalvageable and miserable and hopeless, right? A good breakup exemplifies.
We won behind.
What? Oh. I'm sorry. How long have we been one behind?
Just about two.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, and this is, I was very happy with my choice of image, so I'm glad you had to go. For this and the next slide too, I was smug. Okay, so a good ending, right, exemplifies respect and dignity and careful management of the needs and feelings of yourself and of the other person. It should be like the hospice movement, right? It should be a project of caring and curating, not a project of abandoning or withdrawing care. And it should preserve or enhance the value of that relationship rather than destroying or retroactively erasing that value. And often, just like with the parent and the child, not always, but often, if it's done well and the scaffolding is there, it will make room for a new and different relationship with that person to come into being. But a relationship that ends is no more a failure or worthless than a life that ends, or a book that ends, or a childhood that ends, or a degree program that ends, or a party that ends, right? As you go through a good breakup, like a good death, you want to try to minimize harm to yourself and the other, and to remain clear-eyed about what has been and what the relationship is now becoming. And you remain true to who you are, and you try not to let your personality slip away, although I appreciated the talk about how you might also take this as an opportunity to build on that personality, but that doesn't defeat the fact that you don't want to let your personality slip away, right? Even when the end of a relationship is deeply disappointing because you wanted more out of it, perhaps, that doesn't mean that it failed any more than when you're sad at a death, that invalidates the value of the life that went away, right? Sometimes we want a good thing to be longer than it is, but even when we're sad that something's ending, it's still worth ending it well. I'll do this slide very quickly because I want to get on to the next point, right? But so we can think of this difference between breaking up as an act of integration or as an act of rupture, right? And I want to say that ending the relationship well should be thought of as integrated with and part of the work of the relationship itself. So the end, ideally, should be harmoniously continuous with those same values and narrative that structured the whole, not a sudden breach with different norms and values or a disfigurement where all of a sudden the people who had one set of values about how to treat each other abruptly have different ones instead, right? Whereas a bad breakup is often not integrated with the rest of the relationship. Instead, it might just explode the relationship with acts of harm or betrayal or abandonment, or create a kind of a narrative rupture which isn't integrated with anything and abruptly withdraw care and concern, right? That's about a good breakup and a bad breakup. Moving backwards from that, I think a good relationship, before it ever gets to the breakup stage, should set up and scaffold the possibility of leaving well from the beginning. That's not callous. I think that's loving and caring. But that's impossible when the relationship is conceived of as essentially and ideally eternal and unidirectional. So now I have a few more points coming out of this basic picture that I need to make before, and I know I'm already at an hour, but I'll go for no more than 10 more minutes. Okay, so does all this mean that I'm against commitment? To my surprise, having listened to 2 days of talks, I think it turns out in the end that this is the place where I most disagree with all the rest of y'all. I think my picture of what commitment is really different. Everything, all my other thoughts, I'm like, oh, that resonates really well with this person's point, but I think think about commitment differently from how other talks have talked about. Because you might ask, like, am I anti-commitment, right? Isn't a committed relationship by nature something that you're supposed to try to stick with? Like, isn't that what we mean by commitment? And I think almost everybody who talked said, yes. I want to say no. That recognizing finitude in no way means that we can't be committed. Because a commitment, I want to claim, is not a commitment to some sort of static thing or state that we're going to just try to continue as long as we can. Commitments also have a temporal shape to them, right? What you might be committed to is not maintaining the status quo for as long as you can, but rather what you might be committed to is, with your partner, building a certain kind of narrative that has an arc to it, right? I'm no less committed to writing a book in virtue of expecting to finish it. Nobody would say, oh, well, since you're going to finish your book, you must have not been committed. And I think, I mean, obviously, right? And yet somehow that point hasn't transferred over to relationship commitments, right? So yeah, you and your partner might be committed to living out a certain kind of structured relationship together, which you expect to have a kind of a narrative arc and a finitude to it. Maybe that arc will be so slow that you'll die before it ends, and maybe not, right? My partner and I are deeply committed, I think. And what that means is we're committed to a set of norms and values and mutual support and joint projects. And maybe those will keep going for the rest of our lives. But it doesn't mean that we're committed to continuing our relationship until it literally becomes unsustainable. And I don't think that detracts from our level of commitment, right? Committed relationships, and this is something we've talked about a lot over the last 2 days, create normative entanglements by nature. Like once you're in a committed relationship, you get normatively entangled. And those normative entanglements don't end the instant that the romantic relationship ends, though the end of the romantic relationship is going to transform those entanglements, right? We talked about that so long. So Richard Healy has this paper on commitment and breaking up, and he makes it sound like spooky and paradoxical that you can be committed to somebody and then break up with them, right? He says, well, like if you've made a commitment, then how could a mere speech act dissolve that commitment? Isn't the whole idea of a commitment that you can't just like, you know, voluntarily do a thing and make it go away, right? The point of the commitment is that you don't have the normative power to dissolve it in an instant. So he thinks this is like a deep paradox, right? And I think he's making two mistakes here. First of all, as I just said, I don't think that breaking up is just like canceling or retracting something that was supposed to go on as is forever in the first place, right? So it need not be a violation of the commitment. But also, and this is a new point that I want to make, I don't think that the speech act itself is the breakup. I don't think speech acts like it's over or I'm breaking up with you have that kind of illocutionary force. They're not immediate performatives of that sort. Oh, I skipped a slide. I'm sorry. Am I against commitment? No, I'm not. Okay. Okay, yeah, I missed two, didn't I? Okay, you can just see my cute Roy Lichtenstein picture and then I'll go on. Okay, yeah, so I think that like the bad picture that I'm defending against also goes along with a bad picture of the pragmatics of breakup speech acts, although of course it's very rarely made explicit. But I want to say that breakup speech acts, things like let's break up or it's over, certainly have pragmatic impact, like big pragmatic impact. They really reshape normative space, right? They need to be dealt with. But I think they don't generally function as performatives that have immediate illocutionary force, because a breakup is a narrative process of disentangling at the end of a narrative story, right? It's a temporal phase. It takes time. The speech act is part of this narrative. It's not itself an immediate severing of the narrative. And I think typically merely uttering those words, right? I mean, sometimes you utter the words because you're just joking, right? Like somebody's like, you know, can we see Star Wars for the 7th time? And the other person says, that's it, I'm breaking up with you. They don't mean it, right? Or sometimes it's like said really hyperbolically in the heat of an argument, and it's very clear to everybody that they don't mean it. But even when it's said potentially seriously, right? It demands uptake, but it's not something that just immediately makes the relationship go pfft. It just at most sort of like is an explicit initiation of a final phase or something, which then needs to happen. The words are not themselves the breakup, right? And we basically know that. Like so if somebody says it's over, sometimes the other person will be like, well, crap, okay, I guess it's over. But oftentimes the other person's like, well, no, wait, hang on. Like it's not automatic that ends the relationship, right? Okay, and now we really are getting into the last part of this talk. Okay, so I've talked about these great, lovely, wonderful breakups that are meant to be, they're fantastic. We ended well, why are we so sad, right? So if a timely, appropriate, well-executed breakup is so great, why do breakups so often make us sad? Oh, crap. There we go.
The other one.
Then,
No.
yeah.
Oh, I'm doing the wrong thing. Okay, there we go. Good?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So confusing, the two. All right, because the thing is, we do usually experience sadness or even grief when a relationship, or any other important thing really, ends, even if it ends well and even if it was a good relationship. In fact, especially if it was a good relationship, right? And we experience that sadness at the end of many good things that end well and at the appropriate time, right? Like famously, if you've ever been in a theater production, at the end of it, there's a crash and everybody's sad, right? Or when you finish your university degree and you graduate, or like your time in a city that you love comes to its proper end, or you finish reading your novel or writing your novel, all of these things can be timely and well curated, but accompanied by sadness or grief. And that's, I think, because grief does not mark a bad thing that shouldn't have happened. It's kind of the opposite, right? The grief marks the loss of something that we value. You can grieve the loss of a relationship with value even when it ends well. Just like you can grieve the loss of a life that ended well and at the right time, right? So if grieving appropriately doesn't require that anything bad happened, I think that raises an interesting question about what grief is. And I promise you that at minute 65, I'm not going to give you a whole full theory of grief, but I want to talk about just a little bit to fit it into our story. Oops. Okay, so what is grief? So notice grief is not the same as disappointment. It's not the same as missing somebody. It's not the same as regret, although of course it might be mixed together with all of these things. We think of it as a negative emotion, right? What's negative emotions? It's generally pretty widely acknowledged that you don't simply try to eliminate it immediately or as fast as possible or like medicate it away. We think there's some value to having grief, right? Though I think we have no agreement about exactly when. And there's not philosophical agreement about what grief is. It's a complex thing, right? There's various theories out there. I'm not going to go into all of them, but one of them sort of matters for the point I want to make. Matthew Radcliffe and Louise Richardson have this paper where they claim that grief is a response to a loss of possibilities. And they use the example of involuntary childlessness, and they incorporate a lot of ethnography, talking to people who have experienced involuntary childlessness about how they describe their grief as a shutting down of possibilities. I don't think that works as a general theory of grief, because I think we can grieve things that we never thought it made sense would keep going, or never were like expecting the possibility to be open to us, right? So, if you have a beloved pet that lives a long, great life and then dies a good death painlessly and in your arms, it's not like, oh, I've lost the possibility of this pet being 50. Like you never thought that was going to happen. Right? Or if you love your degree program and then you finish it, it's not like you thought you were going to be a student forever, right? So I don't think it's always lots of possibilities. I want to suggest grief is part of an appropriately attuned full life, because it's a kind of an emotional attunement to the loss of something valuable that was central to our narrative. And I think that there's two kinds of grief that we can think about, and we use the word grief in everyday speech for both of them, but they're really quite different. So grief always marks something that's gone that had value, right? It doesn't make sense to grieve the loss of something that we experienced as just bad, although you might experience disappointment or sadness or regret about that, right? But that doesn't cut it. There's still two quite different emotional experiences that both get called grief, right? One, and they're both represented in the literature. One is grief understood as an attempt to keep something alive that we don't want to let go of, right? Of an attempt to continue a bond with something that we've lost. There's this very famous quotation that everybody loved from the TV show WandaVision, where one of the characters says, "What is grief but love persevering?" It's a beautiful line, but I actually think it's a bad kind of grief, right? This like grief as a holding on. On the other hand, grief can be an emotional attunement to the loss of something, not a holding on to it, but an attunement to the loss of something valuable that has ended, whether or not that ending was timely or planned or for a good reason. And I want to claim that the first type of grief, psychologically explicable, very common, understandable, but ultimately kind of dysfunctional. And if we can get rid of it, we should. We should not fool ourselves into thinking that we can hold on to something that's no longer there. It's a kind of self-deception. The second kind of grief is epistemically apt and it's emotionally appropriate. And this kind of grief can go along with leaving well. And it needn't, but it might even last forever, although over time it might become less constant or less salient, right? So in short, grief can be functional or dysfunctional. It can be epistemically apt or epistemically inapt. But grief is appropriate when what is ended had value and was integral to our narrative and our emotional life, and we're attuned to that loss. And for that reason, good relationships and good relationships that ended well, I think it makes perfect sense to grieve them. And it can go in any direction here. We might grieve the end of a good relationship. We might grieve the end of a bad relationship that had good elements to it. We grieve those elements, right? We might grieve a relationship that had a good breakup or a bad breakup, or we might not grieve any of those things, right? Grief might not, in fact, be our response to them. A relationship can be good, but it might still be a good idea to end it, even though it was good, and then grieve it or not grieve it, right? A relationship can be bad and still have good parts to it, and those parts can be worth grieving, or we might not grieve them. There's every possible combination here, but my basic point is that grief doesn't tell us anything about the badness of the end, right? Grief after a breakup is no measure in either direction of how good the relationship was or whether it should have continued. So finally, I leave you with these thoughts. When we reconceive of relationships as finite and not necessarily progressing in a single direction along a well-trodden path, it becomes easier to have the space and the resources to curate fulfilling narratives and good endings. Positive agency always, not just in the relationship domain, requires meaningful opportunities to leave well, including for relationships. And learning to turn endings and transitions into well-managed, well-curated acts of positive agency that respect and support everyone involved is a skill. We have to learn how to do that. It's a complicated substantive act, not just something that happens, right? But again, like I said earlier, skill isn't enough. The possibility of leaving well has to be scaffolded by our cultural scripts, by our material and economic conditions, and by much more. And the final point then, the final 2 points are, oops, I didn't go to our final slide there. There we go. The length of a relationship or the length of a party or of a writing project is no measure of its value. And in relationships, as in life, finitude and transitions are the essence and not the fail points. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
I'm gonna take questions in waves of 4 because that seems manageable, and also I'm gonna encourage people to try to keep their questions efficient. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I didn't see who got mine.
You're one. I'll start.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I really like the idea that we should reframe leavings and endings as positive acts of agency rather than failures of agency. And I wanted to ask, when it comes to breakups specifically, if you think that this is more intuitive for the person initiating the breakup or for people who are deciding to mutually break up rather than for the person who's on the receiving end or getting
Right.
broken up with. And this is not meant as an objection, I'm just asking.
Yeah,
what's the
no, it's a
scope?
great question.
Or if you think that even for the person who's getting broken up with, we can still find some sense of positive agency in that experience. And I'm asking that because you say that there's positive leavings, and leavings are, you know,
Right,
it's a kind of act that we perform.
right, rather than being left.
Exactly, but also endings, and endings, it seems that would also include not just the person performing
Right.
an action, but the person who's also
Right.
getting broken up.
No, that's a great question. And I suspect that maybe in the ideal, I'm not sure if I believe this, but maybe in the ideal, like if all breakups were perfect, they'd all be mutual, you know? I don't know. But I certainly think it's easier for breaking up to be an act of positive agency if you're the one instigating the breakup. But I think it's part of the ethical responsibility and the fidelity to the relationship and its value of the person who's doing the breaking up, if it's unequal like that, to actually take concrete responsibility for helping the other person make that into an act of positive agency, even if it wasn't mutual. And that's not always gonna work, because sometimes like it just can't always work. Sometimes the other person just desperately doesn't want to be broken up with, and there's nothing you can do to convince them, right? Or there's a million reasons why it might not work. But I think it's part of your job as somebody in a relationship who has decided that it's time to leave, to put energy and resources, if at all possible, into enabling and mentoring the other person into this being positive. And you know, I think Ellie's talk gave us some tools for thinking about that, right? Like Ellie was just talking about, you get dumped and then you go off and you do all these cool positive agency things, but there isn't any reason why the person doing the breaking up shouldn't take an active hand in like trying to scaffold and mentor that person into that kind of positive stage. But all this sounds very rosy, and I know that lots of the time it's not gonna happen, but I just think it would make a big difference if people actually thought that that was like part of their responsibility as they were breaking up, rather than to be like as mean and rupturing as they possibly can find a way to be, right? Yeah, but it's a great question.
I think you were too.
No, not me.
Oh.
I didn't mean you, but it can be you.
No, it's
It can be. Okay, sorry, thanks for the talk, great talk, similar to the last question, but not about breakups, you know, we live in a world where a great deal is not up to us,
Right.
things, and you know, houses burn down, parties get raided by the police, people die suddenly, God forbid. I think like a really strong reading of the idea that ending is a thing we do is like we wrest back the narrative from these abrupt endings and we say, you know, my time in the house isn't over until I perform the ending ritual. Is it that, or is it like there's skill in ending well and there's skill in learning to accept endings that are not up to us?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a lovely question, because like a central theme of my work that I didn't really harp on here is that there's no such thing as independence and like, or absolute autonomy, and there's no such thing as unfettered agency. Like, yeah, we're always wildly constrained by circumstance. So I think I can imagine a circumstance actually where ending well would be a matter of being like, no, damn it, we're gonna stay here until we do the closing ceremony, like as a kind of a political action. Like that's not crazy to me, but I think it would be much too formulaic to think that that's always what it means, right? Making something into an act of positive agency, as I think of positive agency, isn't about making it entirely your own with no influence from anybody else. It's about finding agency within the finite, vulnerable, hopefully decently scaffolded situation we find ourselves. So you got to work with the situation as you find it, right? But people do things like this all the time. Like your house burns down and whatever, you go in and find something that was treasured to you and make a shrine out of it. I don't know, I'm coming up with stupid examples, but we find ways within circumstances that are not in our control of finding these moments of agency and closure. And so I guess it's an extension of that to some extent. But yeah, sometimes I think the actual insisting on the ritual probably is helpful, right? Like if the police raid and you're like, we're not leaving this spot until we finish this ceremony. I can see that as having a point. But yeah, that's a great question. I don't think anyone knows what number they are.
So my question, thanks for your talk, that was awesome. And my question is kind of a two-parter. I have two cases that I think get to the same-ish question. One case is, I used to be obsessed with having good endings, and I would put a timeline on my relationship, like a date, be like, that's when we're breaking up. Did this a few times, and I own it. But it seems, in retrospect, that there were almost certainly a couple of times that I just got it wrong. And there could have been more to, not to it feels like I'm maximizing my hedonism or something to say that maybe the relationship could have gone on a little longer and then had slightly less of a good ending, and still all in all we would have. Anyway, yeah. But the question there is just there's so much weight on there being a right time to end or have a good ending, but it also seems really difficult to know exactly when that is, as opposed to something change it. I guess I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or if you want to expand on that?
Yeah.
And then my other question, which we don't have to get to because there's not very much time, but was about place and changing places where, you know, you're.
You don't get me started. No, go ahead. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
I know you know, a lot about place and knowing places, but it seems like figuring out with the case of like climate change or climate crisis, like when it is appropriate to have an ending with a place is like particularly difficult when it's not something, a place is not someone that you can have a conversation with, or that you can set intentions with. And so, I don't know, those were my two. Sorry.
No, the second question is just like, I would just love to talk about that all night, but I'm not gonna. Yeah, look, I think one way of, when I said that ending well is a skill, I think one way of having a kind of like a nascent, immature, budding, but ultimately not fully developed skill is to think that the way to make endings good is to be overly rigid about planning them out in that way and thinking that you can guess the exact time and then set. So like what you were doing was better than just the exploding the relationship or the like, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn approach. But it was still, as you're saying yourself, pretty limited, right? And I agree, like we're never gonna have absolute epistemic access to this. It's a matter of honing our skills at judging these things, and it's always underdetermined. There usually isn't one exactly right time, and so it's a balancing act. And you know, you can't codify it at all. And it sounds like, you know, in your youth, you hoped that you could, but you know, whatever, you matured out of that. And so yeah, there's like a lot of epistemic uncertainty, and that's part of what makes it hard. And I think that when you combine the epistemic uncertainty, which is just built into the human condition, with the fact that we have these narratives that are deeply entrenched in our culture telling us to hang on as long as possible and save the relationship at all costs. And if you break up, that means you were never committed and you're bad at commitment, you suck at commitment, you suck at relationships. That all pushes our epistemic uncertainty in the direction of making it go longer rather than shorter, right? And I guess what I want to say is, yeah, we're epistemically uncertain, but maybe we can at least chip away at that form of bias that always pushes us towards the, well, maybe it's not the right time to break it off, maybe I can still make it good. And look, this is also not just about relationships. This is like a thing I can't talk about without crying, but I'm going to try. But like we hit this with pets all the time, right? We don't know when the right moment is, often. Sometimes it's obvious, but often we don't know when the right moment is, and we don't want to give up our pet. And so our tendency is to string it out longer than we should. And the pet that I was, you know, I've had many pets who, each one is the best. It's the paradox. But among all of them being the best, there's one who was actually my, like, you know, the one I was closest to. And in retrospect, I'm very clear on the fact that I made a grave moral error by letting her stay alive as long as she did. And it really hurts to think about. So this is not special to relationships. It's hard to know. And this is part of the skill that I'm suggesting that we develop, but it's also part of the cultural scaffolding that we need, right? If we had better scaffolding for saying, you know, sometimes leaving is great, like the last talk said, right? You know, the upsides of leaving, then we would have better frames within which to make those decisions well. The place thing, I honestly, it's such a great question, and it's so close to my interest that I feel like if I start answering it, things will spiral out of control completely. I'm just gonna say, I've been thinking a lot lately about how when you take a relationship and you put it, this isn't quite what you asked, I know, but when you take a relationship that's embedded in one place and you put the same people in supposedly the same relationship in another place, it becomes a different relationship. And sometimes a relationship that was good before becomes no longer sustainable in a new place or vice versa. So our relationship to places is deeply normatively entangled with our relationship to people and everything else. And your point about climate change and so forth, to me, is really emotional and moving, because sometimes we lose a place not because we have decided in a determining way that it's time to move on, but because the place has actually become unsustainable. And between climate change and spiraling capitalism, I think we're just at the beginning of seeing that happen, and we're gonna see it more and more and more and more at a dizzying and terrifying rate. And so we better learn how to leave places well, and like what that means, given that, like you said, we have very little, we can't just be all autonomous and self-determining about it, so we're gonna have to develop other skills for how to let go of places and leave them well. And my God, that's gonna be really hard. I'm less convinced than you are that we can't have a conversation with a place, but that's me going all woo, so I'll back it. Yeah, okay.
So great talk. I really loved it, and I'm gonna, oops. Didn't mean to end the poster. Thanks. I'm gonna do the thing where I'm gonna ask you to help me understand a project I'm working on in light of this.
Yeah.
Because I really liked what you had to say, and it dovetails with something I'm really interested in, which is about narrative value and what narrative contributes to prudential value. So like Dale Dorsey has this, it's kind of a throwaway line, but it really grabbed me of like, well, maybe narrative is the most important part of the good life. And you know, when it comes to a good narrative, of course, the ending, as you've been talking about, is a crucial part of that.
Right.
And I'm wondering not so much about the kinds of endings you were talking about, which are about managing an ending that's sort of foisted upon us, say with a terminal illness or something, but one where you choose it because of its quality to your narrative, as opposed to dignity or suffering or something like that. So I like this. It hit me when you talked about the rave. If you draw it out too long, the narrative gets ruined for the rave. Like
exactly.
it's not ruined, but it gets diminished. Or maybe ruined. Okay. So,
trust me, the 7 a.m. crowd is not the best crowd. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about that, and like Dorsey, this is the thing I'm working on, is this thinking about how much a valuable narrative can outweigh the other goods in our lives.
Right.
So, you know, I think about a poetic ending, like the classic trope would be like a soldier dying in battle to save their comrades or something like that. Dorsey talks about Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, dying by getting speared in the chest by a stingray. Like, for the kind of life he was living, that was a really poetic way to die. Now, those are both ones that would be really hard to engineer if we wanted to engineer them. But there's another case that comes to mind for me, which is Colonel Bruce Hampton, who I guess most of you probably don't know, but he's sort of minor but very influential figure in the jam band world. And he died on his 70th birthday, where there was a birthday concert for him with an all-star tribute band of all these excellent musicians from that world. And he died during the encore singing a song that's very appropriate for this, died by having a heart attack on stage. And it's like, that's a very excellent way to go if you want the right narrative. And that is the kind of thing we could engineer. Right. Like that, oh, okay, I'm a musician. This is gonna be my last big concert. I want that to be the last note I play, you know, in life, not just on stage.
You probably can't engineer the literally dying part, but yeah.
I mean, you could. This is what I mean, though.
Yeah, okay.
We could engineer these things, and this is the question I have about that Dorsey's thing has raised for me, and that I want to explore more. Is narrative value significant enough? That we would die early, not because of a terminal illness or something, but just to get the good ending to our life story, to make the life story the perfect life story for us.
Right.
I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, wow. Who was it no, it wasn't the last session, it was an Ellie session, who was talking about aesthetic value versus moral value? Who was that?
It was me.
Ellie.
That was you yourself, yeah. Okay, yeah. You in your own session. Long few days. I think that there's something really deep here about this, because I think that what you're talking about is in some ways an aesthetic value, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just an aesthetic value, because I also think, like, I don't think our whole lives have to be coherent. I actually went through the presentation last night and realized that I had a few times accidentally used the word coherent and took it out and put integrated instead, because I think this idea that like the good life or the good relationship is one that has this absolutely coherent story to it is like way too, I don't know, high modernist or something. I don't know. That's just not necessarily how it works. However, the narratives can be more or less aesthetically pleasing, but they can also be more or less experienced as self-expressive and comprehensible in a way that supports our agency, right? Like if you're totally out of control of the narrative, it's very hard to have agency because everything is unpredictable. So part of being able to control your narrative is being able to scaffold your own agency by understanding like the directions in which things are going. And I do think that's very valuable. I don't know how to give a metric for when the one outweighs the other, like that there's probably no general answer to that, but I think that you're absolutely right, that there are circumstances under which that can become like a really central value. And that makes sense. And it, you know, I'll go back to it because I like it and I didn't show it for long enough by mistake. You know, the Humphrey Bogart, right? This is one of the great all-time cinematic examples of him curating the ending of the narrative to make the narrative what he wants it to be, right? And he sends her off with the whole speech about how she has to get on the plane, but they'll always have, I mean, I love that we'll always have Paris because it's explicitly saying what I was trying to say in this talk, which is like, us going our separate ways does not devalue the thing that came before. It does not become a failure. It does not, you know. So yeah, there are times where for a whole life or for a relationship or whatever, I think it can become really central to that positive agency and to the satisfyingness of it to really tightly control the narrative. But of course, that's not the only value, and we don't always want the narrative to be that tightly controlled. I know we have very little time, but I just, because you told the musician story, I have to very quickly tell this story. And again, as with my dying dog, I will try not to cry. My dissertation director was John Hoagland. And John Hoagland, this was in 2010. He was old, but not that old. He was in his late 60s, I think. And he had started to develop very early stage dementia. And so we held like a Festschrift conference for him. And very explicitly, we wanted to do it while he was still aware enough to participate in the philosophical, you know, which was successful. And so the conference was like a bunch of us who had worked with him directly, like several of his students who he'd been closest with, but then also colleagues who he had worked closely with for his whole life. And his estranged son, who he hadn't seen in years, came for it. And it was like this huge, it was like an overly corny sitcom. Like everybody important in his life was in that room. And he was so moved, you know, and he could still, in fact, be as smart as ever. It was just, there would be these moments where he would phase off, but it was very successful. And John McDowell was giving a talk, and John McDowell was giving this speech. I went to Pittsburgh. Everybody way overly worshipped John McDowell. It was a weird issue. And I'm very counter-suggestible, so I was like, no. But anyway, that's not the story. But yeah, everybody was in there. They all worshiped John McDowell. So John McDowell was giving this big speech about how John Hoagland had been like the dearest and most important colleague to him of his life. And he had all these memories of them sitting there and doing this Kant reading group where they would read like 3 sentences a week and then they would argue for hours. And in the middle of him giving this speech, Hoagland had a heart attack. And they carried him out to the stretcher. Like he didn't say anything when he had the heart attack, but they carried him out to on the stretcher to the ambulance. And as they put him into the ambulance and we were all like gathered around, he said, well, this can't be how I die. This is way too perfect. And then he died. So like sometimes the poetic thing, it really does tie up a life. Anyway, okay, yes, I'm sorry, next question.
We're already past 6.
Oh, okay.
Well,
We
I was
started
gonna ask
10
my
minutes late,
Let's
but
get 2 more.
2 more? Okay. You
and
got
I'll
up
try to
your
go way
spot
faster on the
earlier.
last ones.
I don't know how to pick someone at random. Who hasn't asked a question yet today?
In the back.
Okay.
You haven't asked anything yet, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. You brought up Berlin, so I will bring up BDSM kink.
Yeah.
So something that I'm getting out of this conference is just like the extreme necessity of proper relationship education.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep thinking like as in like something very structured for all of us,
Yeah.
almost like actual education. And in BDSM kink, right, there are countless conferences, so many events that start with educational sessions.
Right.
Including not just someone talks, but also demonstration you see, and you also get to try out for yourself. And so I keep wondering, like, breakups, we're talking about breakup as skill. So how can we practice a skill like that? But
Right.
another thing, just like with regards to BDSM kink, that I also think about is, before you even start a scene, you negotiate the scene. You negotiate what happens after the scene.
Exactly.
And you commit yourself to aftercare,
Right.
whatever that means. But before you even do that with somebody else, you need to have that figured out for yourself.
Right.
What do you need for aftercare? And that might mean none at all, meaning no
Get away from me.
contact.
Yeah, right.
for example.
Yeah.
But right, this is figured out in advance. And something out of my personal experience recently that I started doing is like explicitly talking about, if I am basically the one doing something, I will make sure, like, I will tell you when this is over, so you do not have to worry about ending it.
Right.
But on the other hand, you also need to know if you, like, can you trust yourself
Right.
to know when to call red, yellow, or
Right.
stop in general? And I feel like this is a kind of question or mindset that might be helpful upon entering into a relationship.
Yeah.
Just like figuring out about yourself and about the other person, if it ever came to a point where you might break up, are
Right.
you able to do that? Can you trust yourself to do that? Very similar to what you were talking about with the raves, right?
Right.
Because rave, relationship ending, and BDSM kink, all heightened emotions. You're not thinking clearly, and so you need to be prepared how to be ready for that. And then I don't know, I just really wanted to throw out these
No,
things
thank you
also
very
into-
much, because this is actually an example very dear to my heart, because I said that this was a putting together of these two projects, the breakup project and the sexual agency project. And the sexual agency project, I've drawn heavily on exactly these dimensions of that subculture, in order to try to rethink how we think about sexual agency in other contexts. And there's at least two things about what you said that I think are so important to what I'm trying to get at. The idea that aftercare is already recognized as part of the whole thing, right? Like, there's this, this is why, I don't want to say too many things, right? But it's really bad if the way sexual encounters stop is when one person just like can't take it anymore and is like, this is so unsustainable. It's like, stop. Like, that's not good, right? What we want is for there to be clarity, and it's just like the intention circles that I was talking about, right? You want to like create clarity in advance about how will we know when it's time for this to end? How will we communicate this to each other? How will we end? And crucially, what will we do after, right? The ending is not the drop off. The ending is the transition. It's part of this final act, and the aftercare is also part of that. And this is basically just saying back to you what you already said, but like, how powerful would it be if we normalized in our culture people who were getting into relationships thinking from the beginning about what aftercare would look like, in the sense of how would we want to treat each other after we broke up? How will we know when we want to break up? How would we break up? But also, what do we want out of each other after we break up? And then, as with all things, that might change as it goes. It may turn out that the reality is not what you planned in advance. We all know that. But having that kind of intentionality about the temporality of it would be, I think, hugely advantageous. And we literally can't do that because we are all told that the way you express romantic love for someone and excitement about them is by maintaining this pretense that it is never going to end, right? If you say, well, let's talk about what to do after, then that is taken in our culture as you not being committed and not being that into it. Right? And this is like really the essential problem I'm trying to get at. How can we rethink the whole temporality of this so that I can be like, I am maximally into you, I am maximally committed to doing this finite thing with you. And part of doing that well is thinking about what comes after. So yeah, basically I'm just slightly repackaging what you said to me because I totally agree. Yeah.
I feel like I just repackaged it.
Yeah. Do I get one more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure my question will be the best way to end, but
The pressure is high for
yeah, so I think it's related to the previous question. I was just really interested in this notion of like this practice of intention circles.
Mhm.
And I think it brings with it like all the value and also complications of kind of making plans for your future self.
Yeah,
And I think like there are cases where like it's clearly valuable, like a DNR, right? Like your future
Right.
self is not going to be conscious to be able to make the decision. And then I think it's also valuable in cases where you think your future self is going to be less rational or like
Right.
less clear-headed than you are now.
Right.
So like maybe cases of partying would be cases like that. And I was thinking like, it's a bit more complicated in the cases of relationships because
Yeah.
you might think that like the relationships can transform yourself in a way that it's not that you're just like less clear-headed. It's just like your preferences
You're just
and your
different
values
now.
are like different.
Yeah.
And so
right.
that in a way that those plans might no longer apply to your current self.
Mhm.
And another thing I was a separate but related point is that I think like, you know, sometimes going into an activity with, it's kind of related to your question, going to activity with an end in mind, or with a kind of like way of ending in mind can change the nature of the activity, right? So like say like I want to walk aimlessly,
Right.
but say like, oh yeah, I want to walk aimlessly, but like somehow end up at like this specific point. And
Yeah.
it feels like, okay, you're not really walking aimlessly anymore, and like some of the joys of walking aimlessly are compromised. So I guess like I was just like wanting to like throw those ideas out there to complicate this notion of like, you know, making intentions for a future self in a
Right.
relationship.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is like a really rich issue because I think, I already forgot which of you told the story about like when you were young saying the relationship was gonna end on this and this day, was it you? Yeah, like that's the end point of what you're talking about, right? So like part of having the skill of doing this, I think, and I don't know that any of us has the skill, like, you know, people are better or worse at it, but I feel like this is a skill that as a society, we have not spent much time cultivating, right? But part of having that skill, I think, is being sort of meta responsive to the not trying to over determine it or under determine it, and to make room for the fact that things may change, right? So for some kinds of relationships, you know, you may be like, I'm totally crazy about you. This relationship is fantastic, but I know that I want to move to this city on this day and I don't want to do a long distance relationship. And so that's going to be the stop point. And that might be very reasonable. It's still, you know, we're not robots, so it still might happen that something changes, but it might make sense to have a much more well-formed, determinate sense, right? For other kinds of relationships, you don't want to like predetermine the end in advance, but you might want to have some guidelines with each other about what kinds of things would make you feel like this was no longer worthwhile. And then, yeah, even then you may change as a person, your values may change, and you may need to go back and revisit it. But at least it's not on autopilot in the same way, right? You may need to go back and say, like, I don't know, you know, you might say, if we ever stop being sexually attracted to each other and we only want to have sex with other people, like for us, having that sexual spark is like key. And so that would be the time, you know, then we could still be good friends, but we wouldn't want to be a romantic couple anymore. That might be a very reasonable thing to say. And that might continue to be reasonable, or you might get much older and you might be like, you know what? Our sex life has died off, but I'm still getting a lot out of this relationship. Can we revisit this and talk, you know, but then that's a conversation to have rather than everything being a tragic torpedo. Like the minute that you talk about ending, then it's like, you know, then everything is a tragic failure, right? So making room for that kind of renegotiation and flexibility, I think, is important, and knowing how much room for flexibility may have, like there's like endless levels to this kind of skill, right? But it takes so much more communication than we do, and so much more scaffolding than we have, because all we're told is, well, if you really love somebody, you want to be with them until you die. That's it, right? And you should do everything to save that, and if you don't, you failed. That's the only story we get, so we don't have any resources. But you're absolutely right that you don't want to, like, one of the ways of making it go badly is to be overly rigid and to not be responsive to the way that you have changed as a person, your values have changed, your circumstances have changed, and so on. Yeah, absolutely. We should stop.
Yeah. Okay.
fantastic. We've had a great relationship over the last 2 days.
It's over.
And like all finite things, it comes to an end. It's a fantastically wonderful end for it to come to. We also know that sometimes there's a process that we have to go through.
I
And that
didn't bring
process,
the glitter poppers, I should have brought
that
them.
process, we have this moment right
Yeah.
now, but that process also requires some negotiation. And if people want to go out for dinner or drinks, there's no plan except the one that we make now together. But thank you so much to everybody. If you're a speaker on the program, there's a copy of the poster for you. There's a cool extra swag for you. If you want to pick up some extra CFCP swag or book swag, it's on the table. And thanks so much, everybody. This is wonderful.